Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Giselle Donnelly and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by my colleagues
Yulia Zhozha with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington Universities, and
Dalib Barohaj, also with AEI.
Our guest today is Andrei Liskovich, a man of many talents and a little bit of a departure for the sort of guests that we've had, as we will discover in the course of the podcast. Our podcast is devoted to the many challenges to European security that have arisen along a line running from the Baltic to the Black Sea, what we call the Eastern Front, and why those are important to the United States. If you enjoy this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you very much. Andrei, welcome. We've been playing calendar tag for some months to try to get you on here. I'm very pleased that we've finally accomplished this objective. You travel back and forth between Ukraine and the United States and points west quite a bit. And I understand you've just recently been to the Southern Front in Ukraine. So before we delve into sort of the larger picture of your work and also how you came to be doing it, I wonder if you could give us kind of a snap update of your last tour of the battlefront.
Thanks for having me, Giselle. I spent most of last week at the Southern Front, Zaporizhia Front, slightly south of Kyiv, which is a regional hub in Zaporizhia. This is the area where two of the main brigades that were involved in the initial counteroffensive actions are trying to push the line south, the 47th and the 33rd Brigade and the reinforcements. It's hard to describe that area without necessarily making this description be inadequate. When you go there, you go to a city that was once a peaceful city with high-rises by Soviet standards, so 9-story houses, apartment buildings. I've been to that town a number of times before. It was peaceful, kids playing in the street. There will be all kinds of local businesses. It would be fairly vibrant town. Now there's barely any civilian population left. There's barely a building that has not been damaged in some way by artillery fire. You go in, none of the infrastructure works. You don't have running water, you don't have electricity, you don't have working cellular connection, and most of the people you run into are the military that are involved in the counteroffensive in one way or the other. I spent a lot of time interviewing troops on their experiences in the first month of the counteroffensive, trying to understand where the bottlenecks are and how we could help. I know there's a lot of speculation about whether or not the offensive is going according to plan and whether there is realistic prospect of getting through, say, to the Sea of Azov. And trying to get their perspective was very important for me to direct our efforts at the fund and try to inform Western policymakers on the possible courses of action that could help that objective. My overall impression is that the fortifications are certainly much more challenging than anticipated. The minefields are incredibly dense. The fields are mined with a 50-centimeter step, so think of it as a 1.5 feet between mines, stretching for hundreds of meters between tree lines. So all of these fields that were normally used for agriculture are now minefields, and they are basically impossible to get through without very significant engineering effort, which requires resources that Ukraine is short on. So what happens, the first thing that was very different from my expectation was the geometry of the battlefield. In my mind, you would have these trenches stretching from west to east, and the Ukrainian forces attacking them in a perpendicular fashion from the north. Apparently the geometry there is completely different. The trenches, in fact, go north to south, and they are hidden in tree lines that separate fields. And so the counteroffensive is, in fact, approaching these tree lines from the north, and in these narrow lines they're trying to advance. They're trying to push out folks from these trenches in the southern direction. So it's incredibly difficult geometry because all of the paths through which the Ukrainian forces are approaching are predictable. There are only so many areas from which the forces can approach. And so they get met with crossfire from multiple tree lines and from behind the hills in the rear. So it's a very challenging area to get through. And what I came to understand was that these frontal tactics, even though there was a chance that they would succeed in the first couple days through surprise and through disorganization on the Russian side, that clearly did not materialize. And so now Ukraine needs to do something that either disrupts the logistics in the back and makes it untenable to hold these positions, or materially steps up the power of the firepower that's applied to these fortifications, because the fortifications built there are able to withstand 155 millimeter direct hits, which is fairly different from any other area that Ukraine has liberated before. So it requires a reconsideration of tactics. These delays have clearly forced the Ukrainian command to take a step back and try to think about what they should be doing instead. They have still not deployed the majority of their reserves. So there's still, it remains to be seen whether with some additional equipment that helps demine and that helps increase the firepower directed at these fortifications, so whether Ukraine can break through. I will certainly do what I can to try to make sure this equipment is available.
If we can stay in this topic a little bit, and I probably will geek out over it a little bit and bait Dalibor and Yulia back later if I have to. So that's hugely interesting to me, Andrei. I have just a couple questions about how the Ukrainians think that they want to adapt to the different technical geometry that you described. And secondly, and possibly as important, if not more so the Russians obviously had many months to cook up this defensive scheme. My question is, do we see them in periods between attacks or strikes going back out to repair and reinforce and refurbish the defenses? Or, should we think that the Ukrainians can, chip away, degrade the defenses to the point where there will be a substantial disruption that will allow for more decisive maneuver and penetration? I just wondered if you had any thoughts on those two subjects.
This is exactly the question I asked repeatedly. I wanted to understand whether there's a way to incrementally get through. So my read is that it's possible, but there's a lot of conditions. So the first thing that it's important to keep in mind that the Russian troops are able to replace mines if Ukraine, having demined an area, does not control it by directly having shooting access to it. So if it cannot cover those areas, the Russians are able to replace the mines overnight. They also have remote mining capability where they use MLRS systems to effectively throw these mines. However, in areas where there is fire control, Ukraine has been able to clear out some areas, not very large areas, but nevertheless, it has been done. With the trenches, some of these fortifications, they're not going to be penetrated with 155 millimeter shells. So they need different, more powerful munitions, or basically, if the interesting question is, there's been a group of military analysts visiting Ukraine in the last week, and I asked them about how the DoD would approach the same fortifications had the U.S. had the same constraints as Ukraine. So we're assuming there's no B-52 bombers. And they said, well, we wouldn't. So our actual approach would be to bomb the hell out of it, so literally make sure there's nothing left by applying overwhelming firepower, and then would send the infantry. So the question is, given that Ukraine does not have F-16s and significant air capability that would allow it to deploy much larger munitions than 155 millimeter shells to get these fortifications destroyed, is there an alternative? There seems to be a way with potentially JDAM type munitions, the gliding bombs that do not require flying over these positions, that can be thrown from a distance of 20, 30 miles away. But it remains to be seen whether these could be deployed effectively. We know from the leaks that Russia has been able to jam these JDAMs because they're GPS guided, and so anything that's GPS guided ends up being vulnerable to jamming, so they end up not hitting the target. However, there are other ways to aim these munitions, and in my mind, there might be a path where these larger munitions will be deployed against these fortifications. It remains to be seen whether this is viable. I'm not a military expert, so I'm trying to relay the sort of overall impressions from different sources, but I feel there is a path forward without dramatic improvement in capabilities. There are certain things that need to be done, but with the constraints that Ukraine has, again, the DoD told me that they would probably not have done much better. Again, assuming they have no overwhelming air superiority. So it's hard to tell. Time will tell. Ukraine does need some additional capabilities, not dramatically different, but somewhat different, and on a quantity as well. There need to be some improvements, but I think there's a path. Whether or not it becomes viable, we'll see.
The news of the cluster munition that's going to be provided to Ukraine, does that make any difference in this context or not?
So it's interesting. I got the impression that they would be far more relevant in defensive operations when the enemy has concentration of forces that is then deployed against the Ukrainian positions. And that statement remains to be true. However, there's quite a few targets that the other side has to deploy and kind of make them relatively vulnerable. Things like electronic warfare stations that end up playing a significant role in covering their forces and interfering with Ukrainian drones and other radio frequency or navigation dependent navigation systems. And taking out those is very difficult with artillery, with single shots, because they're able to move, and cassette munitions, these cluster munitions, are able to, in fact, take out these electronic warfare stations by damaging their antennas, by creating sufficient damage. Even if they're not destroyed, they end up being inoperable for a significant period of time. So I think there's a way to deploy them. I don't think they'll be used at a very large scale. They will be used against very specific kinds of targets, because I don't expect large concentrations of exposed troops to be visible in the defensive posture. And
reachable neither. Can I take maybe a step back within this? Are we done with the geeking out? Can I?
It could resurface at any moment
just for now.
Without warning. Yes, but please proceed.
Just for now. You're very familiar with the discussions, the political discussions about the war, and they've come up in endless and very painful ways now with the Vilnius summit as well. But the reality is that Ukrainian leadership, political and military, has been saying, having a view on these minefields, etc., has been saying basically since spring, we are, at the end of the first half of the war. We're sort of close to the middle. And every time they would say this, no matter how high level, the majority that I've seen of Americans will roll their eyes and scoff and say, no, we need to make progress, we like a winner, all of that. But over the last week, just before the Vilnius summit, I've started seeing this exactly the same words being replicated now at the U.S. level in Washington, D.C. And so this is a good sign on the one hand, but on the other hand, what trickles out of what you're describing and what I think public narratives from the Ukrainian side are trying to communicate in a way that makes sense and kind of slowly familiarizing the Western public with that, is that it's going to be very difficult. And the question that I have then is, how is, in your understanding, and I guess generally in Ukraine, from what you've seen, this summer going? Can we expect at the end of the dry season, non-mud season, to have any strategic gains that will, let's be honest, ensure more political and military support from the West? Or do people expect that we have to start coming to terms with the fact that given this complicated geometry that you're describing, we will just not be making significant strategic progress that people are hoping for?
So predictions are always difficult. I've always tried to duck and dodge these types of questions because my military expertise is inadequate. And I'm yet to see somebody with the military expertise whose predictions...
So that should be no disincentive to prognostication.
What I would say is that there is certainly a narrative that's being communicated domestically by the Ukrainian officials to the domestic audience that, in fact, it has consistently been that we're winning just a little bit longer and we will decisively change the dynamics of the battlefield. And for some reason, that narrative continues without much change domestically. So if you watch domestic TV, again, the Ukrainian party line is that the Russians are panicking, they're disorganized, they are in retreat a little bit more, and we'll just wait, we'll push a little bit harder and we'll break through. Again, I can't comment on whether that's a wise thing to project domestically, but clearly those predictions are hard to square with some of the events that have been unfolding, and it certainly has taken way longer than the original forecasts suggested. And there's a very material cost. When I was taking off, my train was taking off from Kyiv on this trip, I saw 50 ambulances pull up to the train station waiting for the medical evacuation train that was bringing the wounded from the front. And when you see 50 ambulances, one after another, enter the platform, you understand this is not something that is without cost. This is a very heavy scene when you depart and see that. So obviously Ukraine has a very strong incentive to not make this an indefinite, endless war. At the same time, it has a strongly articulated line on what Ukraine defines as victory. And in between, there is a very wide gap. It's unclear how that victory can be achieved with the currently available means. I have very little doubt that victory can be achieved, but with dramatically larger fighting force that has been trained and equipped. Ukraine does have a significant number of people mobilized, but a lot of them have either not gone through training yet or don't have enough equipment to break through. So I try not to forecast how long this will take. What instead I'm trying to do is switch from this betting on different horses mentality to try to do something about it and change the outcome. And I think there is quite a lot that can be done even without appealing to governments. There's an incredible amount of work that has been done by private organizations that have been way more responsive to these learnings from the battlefield, because they don't need to go through multiple chains of multiple levels of these escalation chains that often pervert the message and are slow to react to these observations in the field. So I think there's quite a lot that can be done. Again, I think from the folks on the ground, they believe that mistakes have been made in operational planning. So in some sense, it was possible to predict that minefields would be a problem, and probably insufficient weight was placed on the scenario where the initial breakthrough does not succeed, so they had to have a plan B, and they seem to believe in that breakthrough too much early on. But these mistakes are forcing some amount of reflection and changes that are currently being contemplated. And if the new plan is properly resourced, again, I think it's feasible to make substantial territorial gains. What they are, I don't know. It seems that with the current level of resources, it's highly unlikely that the 1991 border is achievable. But it doesn't mean that it's not achievable. It's a matter of resourcing and the ability of the sufficient level of consensus in the West that this is a desirable outcome. I don't see that level of consensus yet. I don't know if it will ever be there, but we need to deal with reality as it is, not as what we want it to be.
This seems like a good time to pivot to a discussion of the Ukraine Defense Fund, and also I think our listeners would benefit from understanding how you came to this work. So, Andrei, tell us your life story in a summary way. Tell us about the fund and the successes you've had and what the challenges are. And also, this is also a story about what we were just talking about, the innovation and adaptation of Ukrainian forces to the war that they've had to fight, which is a sometimes told story, but one that is constantly changing and is pregnant with lessons for the United States and Western armies as well. So that's a big plate that I just shoved in front of you. So pick at it any way you like.
So very briefly, my story is I grew up in Ukraine, finished high school, went to Moscow to do my undergrad and lived there for 6 years, did my master's as well, and then came to the US for my PhD, and after my PhD went to Silicon Valley and worked for a number of companies, most recently
so
for Uber.
PhD is from Harvard in public policy.
Yes. I graduated in 2015, and since then I worked with a number of companies in Silicon Valley, and most recently I ran a division at Uber called UberWorks that did gig work for other types of jobs besides driving through the same approach. When the war started, I came back to Ukraine on February 27th. It was a pretty dark period in Ukrainian history, those first few days of the invasion. And I was going there not knowing how long this would last, but there was a real chance that it would be over in days. We are now a year and a half later, and it's not over, and there's no end in sight. But what I knew would be very important was there are times in history when a relatively small number of people can change the trajectory of where the country is going. Ukraine's own recent history shows that in 2014, when Mariupol was captured, it was recaptured by Ukraine with a force of 30 people. A single platoon was able to retake Mariupol in 2014, about a month and a half after it was captured by the separatists. And I thought that there might be these types of circumstances where, again, a small number of people, if they are at the right place at the right time, with sufficient level of commitment, they might alter the course of how these things unfold. I arrived in my hometown and went to the conscription office where I was declined. I volunteered to join armed forces, and there was a long line of people trying to do the same thing, and they literally had nothing to receive from the army. The army was giving them a rifle and 2 magazines of spare ammo. They had no shortage of volunteers, but they were inadequately prepared to equip them. And so they basically assigned me a convoy with 2 people who were driving with me and asked me to buy equipment for these folks locally, which I was doing for the first 2 weeks. And then when the inventory ran out locally in Zaporizhia, we founded a 501c3, a US-based nonprofit called Ukraine Defense Fund that started to do it in a more systematic way, raise donations in the West, buy equipment in the West, ship it in record time in less than 90 hours to Zaporizhia and Donbass, and hand it out to the troops. We did that with a group of early Uber employees who were quite used to operating in very adversarial circumstances. Uber faced physical violence in many markets. As you know, Uber vehicles were burned in many countries. Some Uber executives were jailed, even in France. So these folks were primed to operate in very adversarial conditions, and they were a perfect crew to make a difference early on. Approximately in June of last year, we started to see a material decline in donations as people realized that government's now passing large bills to support Ukraine, and they thought that their contribution would be minuscule compared to Uncle Sam's contribution. They assumed that Uncle Sam would be spending money on the exact same categories, which has not turned out to be the case so far. And since then, we focused primarily on brokering transactions instead of buying from scratch. So what we're trying to do, most of our work consists of identifying Western technology that's useful in Ukraine, generally dual-use, commercial, non-lethal technology, like drones, communication systems, navigation systems, intelligence software, etc., connecting them to the end user in Ukraine, so that making sure that's the right product, and then finding a source of funds in the West, a government source of funds in the West that will be willing to pay for this. So in this transaction, trilateral transaction, the money does not go through us. We're just trying to make sure that this happens. But because the government funds are used, the scale of these transactions is dramatically larger than what we could have raised privately. We've now done about $12 million in private fundraising, and we've helped broker a number of transactions that have a collective value of about $85 million, so a much larger amount. Of course, we're not the only party involved in making them happen, but we played a significant role in either expediting or making them happen at all, these transactions. So our work has been focused on that. And at present, our key objective is to make sure that these predictable categories of products that Ukraine now needs in a non-lethal commercial technology space are provided not just by volunteers, not just by NGOs, not just by soldiers themselves, but that there's a more scalable way to buy them, and we're trying to work with U.S. Congress to raise awareness that commercial non-lethal technology is a major multiplier on all existing lethal aid that Ukraine has received. It increases precision of the weapons that are being sent. It reduces the expenditure of ammo, and it makes the equipment safer because it doesn't need to shoot as many rounds, so it doesn't need to be in a firing position for as much time, and it can leave and therefore not be hit with fire from the other side in response. So we're trying to make sure that this category is appreciated as very important, and that the U.S. Allocates separate fund for this type of product. So we're working in this brokering world largely. We're also working with a number of vendors trying to make sure that tech gets to the state where it's properly dual use and not just dual use in name only, where it really works in the field. Unfortunately, a lot of the Western tech has proven to not be very effective in Ukraine because it was designed against hypothetical adversaries in Afghanistan and Iraq, where, again, the other side did not have sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities, and in Ukraine, those products fall out of the sky. It's very, very visceral. You see it, you buy a plane for $250,000 and it falls out of the sky, it can't land. So things like this require that there's a bridge, somebody who connects the user to the company, and we're playing that role. Besides our work, there's a number of organizations in Ukraine that are systematically supplying the army in ways that are way more effective than the chain of command, than the Ministry of Defense and the allies. And it's remarkable that these private organizations, having just dozens of people, not even triple digits numbers of people, are able to make qualitative difference to the outcome of the war. We will never know what impact we had on the early days, but I know that when I arrived in Zaporizhia, the enemy was 25 miles from the front. Today, the enemy is 25 miles from the front. Well, from Zaporizhia. So from Zaporizhia. So the distance between the Zaporizhia and the forward deployed Russian troops was 25 miles, and it's still 25 miles. So again, we will never know to what extent our work helped, but we would like to think that there was some contribution that those early efforts played a role in.
So thank you for explaining this to us. And I think it's important that you mentioned this in passing, that in June donations were reduced or subsided. And when you talk about the different organizations in Ukraine, it almost sounds as if Ukraine has got this covered. In comparing the front line, it does. But I think it's also useful to highlight one more time that it's not all covered and that the shortages are amazing. And I'll give one quick example that I know firsthand and then ask you what more we should be donating for or looking out and how we can help. One of my friends, her husband is fighting near to where you just were, and in their unit, they only have one night vision goggles for 12 people. And so he asked her if she can raise individually without the organizations in the United States where she lives money for more goggles. And she also bought out of her money boots that were good enough for him to be able to use them. He himself, they're not sharing the boots, obviously. But to me, these are very palpable examples that there's a lot more to be done and a lot more needed. So would you talk us through what your priorities are, the way you're reading them from the front, where people can help most in terms of donating money?
This is an excellent question. This is the fundamental blind spot, I would say, in the West. The types of equipment that you described, non-lethal technology. This is, night vision, but there's a number of categories, and I'll go through them. They play a massive role in combat, but they have largely not been provided in significant quantities by the U.S. And in fact, Ukraine has not requested them. So there's a reason why the U.S. has not provided them. Ukraine has not requested them in significant quantities. When I'm talking about commercial non-lethal technology, I mean 4 big categories. One is transportation, so simply moving people and goods around, mobility that allows people to be mobile and redeploy and just carry equipment with them to small operations, from used pickup trucks to cargo vans to buses to larger vehicles. All of that is in very short supply, and all of these vehicles constantly get hit, so they need to be repaired and replaced. They're not that expensive. A single pickup truck used costs $5,000, and they need them frequently. And when you talk to pretty much any unit, they would ask you to buy those. So that category is universally needed for almost every unit at the front. The second category is portable energy. And that portable energy basically means generators, and I apologize, there's probably a fire truck running by my hotel. So actually it's not fire truck. This the Korean president is staying here. So I think it's his entourage that's being allowed through the city.
For the record, Andrei is in Warsaw.
Yeah, I'm passing through Warsaw on my way to DC. And in the portable energy category, again, think about you being in an area where the normal civilization has retreated, where you no longer have things that you would take for granted in the city, electricity, running water, where you would have connectivity, like all of these things are missing. So you need to replace them with something that serves those functions. And so on energy side, you need some way of generating power and storing it. So those batteries and generators are needed everywhere. The third big category is communications equipment. And again, the foremost product in that category is Starlinks. Everyone at the front would tell you that they're relying on Starlinks. It's a big component that allows them to communicate along the chain of command and, in fact, helps all kinds of forward deployed units, including the ones that are in motion while driving, to correct fire and communicate critical information. And the other piece to communications equipment is radio equipment. It's portable two-way radios and portable cell towers that allow you to extend the reach of a Starlink, for example. And the fourth category is a very broad set of equipment, largely described as intelligence, counterintelligence, electronic warfare equipment. You can think of it as, the prime example there would be a drone. A drone is a sensor that's attached to a platform that delivers it, flying quadcopter, for example, and it allows you to see from a distance what's happening in the battlefield. So there's a large number of different sensors that need to be deployed: acoustic, radio, visual, night vision, etc., and different platforms for delivery. It could be a quadcopter, it could be a plane, it could be an aerostat, a rover, a mast. There's a range of different platforms. And then there is software that ties it all together so that all of this intelligence equipment ends up in the same spot, so the troops can have situational awareness. They can see what they know about the enemy from all kinds of different assets that are deployed, so they can plan their operations and do something that's not going to lead to massive casualties when they approach without knowing what's ahead. And I would say within this category, there's also this subset of personal equipment like phones, tablets, laptops, monitors that are also universally needed to see this information, to interact with it. And any unit that you talk to would have needs across these categories. When you look at how they've been supplied, virtually none of them, with some exceptions, have been provided by the US, and Ukraine has not requested them. Why has Ukraine not requested them? It is because the funds available through USAI and FMF buckets are also available for lethal aid, and Ukraine wants lethal aid first and foremost. It's prioritized over everything else. So they feel like if they would ask for these types of equipment, they would cannibalize their lethal budget. And so that's why we believe it's incredibly important to complement through other channels these needs. So far, the NGOs have raised about $600 to $700 million for these types of needs. And my estimate that the troops themselves have bought several $1 billion worth of equipment using their own salaries. So what people in the West often don't appreciate is that the number one buyer of this equipment is the troops themselves, who take money out of their paycheck. They routinely spend on average, a quarter of their paycheck to go buy what they need, either outfits for themselves or these needs for sections, platoons, companies above them. Because otherwise they're just going to get uniforms and food from the top and everything else, and weapons. But everything else they'll have to figure out on their own. And so those needs, the problem is a lot of this equipment is not going to last for very long. It would have a short lifespan, so it needs to be replenished at all times. And there's a constant need for this procurement. So for us, it is obviously preferred to be able to go and buy it directly. This way you're able to get the best prices and the shortest delivery times. But the most scalable way is to convince the US government to allocate a separate bucket of money for these types of needs, so Ukraine would then start requesting against that bucket without cannibalizing their lethal aid. So that's kind of two of our main priorities.
If I may, just to follow up on your point about your business model, so to speak, the sort of brokering element of this connecting Western technologies and end users in Ukraine. What I find fascinating about that is that it must rely on a fairly decentralized and flexible sort of system of decision making in place within the Ukrainian military that allows for this kind of experimentation, and you never know in advance what kinds of gadgets are going to work or not, which are going to be suitable for the battlefield or not. Have you ever encountered difficulties within the Ukrainian armed forces, kind of people being prickly about this idea that you have this sort of NGO coming in and connecting with the sort of end users on the battlefield, or has the system already been sort of geared towards this kind of decentralization, or polycentrism, if you will?
Well, the Ukrainian army historically has been quite decentralized since 2014, and it was a necessity. There was no other way to supply the military on all kinds of needs than to accept aid from outside. When it comes to transactions that are paid for by foreign governments, you always need the buy-in of a Ukrainian stakeholder, because Ukraine needs to submit a letter of request to the allies, which then allocate funds, which then go to the vendor, and then vendor ships this equipment to Ukraine. So there is a need for cooperation from the Ukrainian government on each transaction. Otherwise, it won't happen. Otherwise, the ally would not allocate funds. I would say that by and large, Ukraine has been very reluctant to issue those letters of request against funds that could be used for weapons, and more willing to do so for funds that could not be used for weapons. And as a result, most of the transactions that we've done, they've been not paid by the US, but they've been paid by Germany, which has provided less lethal aid than others. And at least at the time. They've scaled that up more recently, but last year they were behind other allies on lethal equipment. And the challenge, of course, is, again, in the perfect world, the MOD would have their own brokers who would do this. We're effectively acting as a buyer's agent. We're kind of trying to help them scout different technology options, vet them, and then try to identify sources of funds that could be used against them. So we're trying to augment their bandwidth. And again, in the normal world, it would be done by somebody who is on their payroll doing this work. But because at present they are short on this expertise and the folks who can go to the West, travel, and explore vendor relationships and do additional follow-up if something goes wrong, they do welcome this help. For now, it doesn't mean that this will persist. But so far, the Ukrainian chain of command has understood its limitations and has been open to accept help from the outside.
Andrei, I want to ask you one last question about this subject. So you read about how this is unfolding in units in Ukraine, and you read about use of Chinese cell phones and Mavic drones, which you can still get at Best Buy, but it'd be difficult to imagine U.S. government funds being made available for a Chinese drone. I mean, I don't actually know what the rules are, but you can imagine that. And there's also the question of Starlink and how Elon Musk feels about the Ukraine war today or tomorrow. It's my understanding that some of the issues have been resolved in regard to Starlink, but if you could give us an update on that. And as you source commercially derivative technology for the Ukrainian army, do you find yourselves looking outside? Again, China's just a huge source of cheap technology in large numbers, and I'm not picking on the Chinese, using it as an example of a good place to go shopping. But I'd be interested in whether that causes you any either internal anxiety or external pushback.
Dependence on the Chinese supply chain is significant. It is clearly a problem. The question is, do we really have a choice in the short term? And
right.
I would say that on drones in particular, on small drones like DJI Mavic 3, different modifications, 3, 3E, 3T, 3 Pro, my view is that nobody in the West is going to have a viable replacement at a comparable price point to that drone in the next 12 to 18 months, and maybe even longer. And certainly Ukraine would not be able to replicate these domestically on this kind of time scale. So longer term, it is an issue that the DoD appreciates. They understand that they're behind the best made US drone in the same class is 5 to 7 times more expensive, and in fact worse on every spec. Camera, data link, navigation. Like
that's the Defense Department for you.
But it's still not made by the Defense Department.
Okay,
it's
so
private companies,
okay.
but they are way behind because the scale is 2 orders of magnitude smaller than the DJI scale, and DJI has gotten to this incredible level of dominance globally. So it is a significant problem, and I do understand the limitations. So it's unlikely that U.S. funds would go toward funding those types of products, but if they go toward funding other types of products that are made in the U.S., including night vision equipment, which is made in the U.S., it frees up the funds that either Ukraine itself or the people who raise funds for Ukraine can deploy for that Chinese technology. Of course, China does not sell into Ukraine directly, so it's all parallel imported through third countries. China understands full well where these products are going, and they're making a lot of effort to lock down Ukraine's ability to use these drones in Ukraine. And so the new version, each new version of firmware needs to be jailbroken to be usable without material risk to the lives of the operators, because coordinates of every drone get communicated to DJI and then relayed to the Russians if they have aeroscopes, these devices that display both the drones and operators on the map using the information provided by the drone and the controller directly. So in order to make them not talk to DJI servers or tell those servers fake coordinates like 00 latitude, longitude, as if you're
put some Russian coordinates in there.
Yes. So the challenge, of course, is with every version, you need to redo this jailbreaking. It is never guaranteed that it will be successful. It takes a lot of effort. It's also very costly. So I would say that yes, there will be limitations to how the U.S. could deploy these funds. And at the same time, there's quite a lot that could be bought in the U.S. Transportation, there's plenty of pickup trucks in the U.S. Plenty of used school buses in the U.S. that could be sent at fairly low cost. And in fact, materially augment Ukrainian logistics capabilities to move things around, to move people around, and in fact create specialty vehicles like showers or laundries for the people who sit in the trenches for weeks at a time and get skin conditions that make it very difficult for them to fight. So those are not luxuries, those are necessities, and they can be achieved with used equipment. So in some sense, the ask is to send American garbage to Ukraine. It's better than nothing. So that's the first point. The second point is, I think there is a path to develop different products in the categories I described, especially larger drones, where DJI does not play, where Chinese companies do not play because there's no large commercial market for them. They are much more likely to be used in military applications or in very niche commercial applications. And I think there's a viable path to create products using best Western components that would be tailored to these adversarial conditions where GPS doesn't work, where your communication link is disrupted or jammed with the pilot. And I think Ukraine can make a very big difference there by having the R&D co-located with the end user. So this is the fundamental piece of the Silicon Valley playbook that is missing for Western vendors today. They're too far from the end user to be able to tailor their product to the needs. And even if they do it, they think of it as a one-shot operation. I've done it, now I'm golden. That's not the case, because this war is a constant arms race, literally an arms race. The enemy will find new ways to disrupt the equipment, so you constantly need to iterate on countermeasures. And as a result, if you're not faster than the enemy at these iterations, you're going to be behind. So you need to be able to have this loop that's closed locally. And one of the highest leverage applications of funds is to deploy them against R&D in Ukraine for these types of products. So that can then serve the West, because the exact same countermeasures will be used by China. You can be absolutely certain they'll be jamming GPS, they'll be jamming comms links, and they'll be learning from this conflict in other theaters. So all other near-peer adversaries, and not even near-peer, some of these capabilities are very cheap. Jammers you can buy for $1,000. So in many cases, this will become democratized in a bad way. Like all kinds of bad guys will now have capabilities to disrupt commercial equipment. And so there will be a massive need for hardening that equipment against simple disruptions. And this is where there's currently a lack of funding or shortage of funding. I don't want to say lack, there's still some funding. But putting money into that work will have the highest leverage and the highest impact in the 6 to 12 months on a 6 to 12 months time scale.
Andrei, thank you so much for spending so much time with us. our hopes and dreams sail in you, at least here on the Eastern Front. And I hope you'll come back and join us periodically with these kinds of updates. It's so hard to get a fingertip feel for what the war is truly like without talking to people like you. So I deeply appreciate it. So from me, Giselle Donnelly, and
Julia Joja, and
thanks to everybody for listening to the Eastern Front. Our podcast is dedicated to the security challenges that have arisen along the line from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website at aei.org, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please do be in touch with us on Twitter using the hashtag Eastern Front Pod, that's all one word. And if you enjoyed the episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.